The soft hum of laboratory equipment filled the air as Kim Tae-ho hunched over his workstation, his eyes fixed on the holographic display showing complex DNA sequences. Outside his window, the gleaming towers of New Seoul stretched toward the evening sky, their surfaces reflecting the golden sunset. He barely noticed the breathtaking view anymore. It had become just another backdrop to his solitary life. At 32, Tae-ho had achieved everything his parents had ever dreamed of for their only son. He held 2 doctoral degrees, commanded respect in the scientific community, and worked at humanity's most prestigious research facility. Yet here he was, alone again on a Friday night, finding comfort in the predictability of genetic codes. The memory of last week's disaster still made him cringe. The department head's daughter, Song Ma-young, had seemed interested at first. They had talked about quantum physics over coffee, and for once, Tae-ho thought he had found someone who understood him. But when he started explaining his theories about alien DNA structures during dinner, her eyes had glazed over. By dessert, she was texting under the table. He never heard from her again. Dr. Kim, the lab's eye assistant, chimed in, interrupting his thoughts. Your presence is requested in the main conference room. Tae-ho sighed, saving his work. Another meeting where he would sit quietly in the corner, speaking only when directly addressed about his research. He straightened his lab coat and checked his reflection in the darkened screen. His black hair was slightly messy, and dark circles under his eyes betrayed too many late nights spent working. He made a half-hearted attempt to smooth down his hair before giving up. The conference room was already full when he arrived. Director Park stood at the front, his usually stern face animated with excitement. Tae-ho slipped into a seat at the back, nodding politely to his colleagues who barely acknowledged his presence. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Park began, I have extraordinary news. The Interstellar Council has chosen our facility to host the first long-term alien research delegation in Earth's history. The room erupted in excited murmurs. Tae-ho sat up straighter, his heart racing. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for his entire career. The Nadiri have expressed particular interest in our genetic research division. Director Park continued, his eyes scanning the room. Dr. Kim, your recent paper on cross-species DNA adaptation caught their attention. Suddenly, all eyes were on him. Tae-ho felt his face grow hot. Thank you, sir, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The delegation arrives in 2 weeks. I expect everyone to make our visitors feel welcome. Director Park's gaze lingered on Tae-ho. This could be the beginning of a new era in human-alien relations. Back in his lab, Tae-ho's hands trembled as he pulled up everything he could find about the Nadiri. The holographic displays filled with images of the alien species, tall, elegant beings with iridescent scales that changed color with their emotions. Their civilization was centuries ahead of humanity's in many ways, yet they had reached out to Earth for collaboration. Hours passed as he absorbed every detail about Nadiri biology, culture, and social customs. The sun had long since set when his phone buzzed. A message from his mother. Son, your cousin Jin-woo is getting married next month. He met such a lovely girl at work. When will you bring someone home? I worry about you being alone. Tae-ho closed the message without responding. His mother meant well, but she didn't understand. How could she? She had never experienced the crushing weight of repeated rejection, the painful awareness that something about him just didn't fit with other humans. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Tae-ho threw himself into his work, updating his research, preparing presentations, and reorganizing his lab. His colleagues joked about his increased intensity, but he ignored them. For once, his social awkwardness might be an asset. The Nadiri were known for valuing direct communication and logical thinking over small talk and social niceties. The night before the delegation's arrival, Tae-ho stayed late in his lab, running final checks on his equipment. The city lights twinkled below, and for the first time in years, he felt hopeful, Perhaps among the stars, there were beings who would understand him better than his own species did. As he gathered his things to leave, he caught his reflection in the window. The same awkward, lonely man stared back at him, but something had changed in his eyes. Tomorrow would bring aliens who had crossed light years to study humanity. Maybe, just maybe, they could teach him something about belonging. The security system beeped as he locked up his lab. Tomorrow would change everything. He could feel it in his bones. Whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. But for the first time in his life, Kim Tae-ho was ready to embrace the unknown. Walking home through the quiet streets, he looked up at the stars twinkling between the skyscrapers. Somewhere up there, the Nadiri ship was approaching Earth, carrying beings who might finally understand his passion for science without judging his social shortcomings. The thought made him smile, a rare, genuine expression that softened his usually serious features. His apartment welcomed him with its familiar silence, but tonight it didn't feel as empty as usual. He fell asleep dreaming of iridescent scales and scientific discoveries, unaware that his life was about to change in ways he could never have predicted. Soon, he would discover that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs happen not in the lab, but in the heart. And sometimes, those who feel most alone among their own kind find their place among the stars. The morning sun cast long shadows across the landing pad as Tae-ho stood with the other scientists, watching the Nadiri ship descend from the sky. Its silver surface gleamed like liquid mercury, moving with an impossible grace that made Earth's most advanced spacecraft look primitive in comparison. His heart pounded against his ribs as the ship's landing ramp extended, releasing a soft hiss of pressurized air. The first Nadiri emerged into the sunlight, their scales shifting through shades of blue and green that Tae-ho instantly recognized as indicators of curiosity and excitement. Among the delegation, one figure caught his attention immediately. She stood slightly taller than her companions, her scales rippling with complex patterns that suggested deep thought. The data files had mentioned that Nadiri females typically displayed more intricate color variations than males, but seeing it in person left him breathless. Director Park stepped forward to greet the visitors, his practiced diplomatic smile in place. "Welcome to Earth. We are honored by your presence." The tall female Nadiri moved to the front of her group, her scales shifting to a warm gold. "The honor is ours," she replied in perfect Korean, her voice carrying musical undertones that made Tae-ho's skin tingle. "I am lead researcher Harry. We have looked forward to this collaboration." As introductions continued, Harry's gaze swept across the assembled humans, pausing when she reached Tae-ho. Her scales flickered with a pattern he didn't recognize, and she tilted her head slightly. "Dr. Kim Tae-ho," Director Park said, gesturing for him to step forward. "Our leading xenobiologist and the author of the paper that caught your attention." Tae-ho moved forward on legs that felt like jelly. Up close, Harry's scales were even more mesmerizing, shifting through subtle variations of color that hinted at complex emotions beneath the surface. "Your work on cross-species genetic adaptation was remarkable," Harry said, her scales pulsing with academic interest. "Particularly your theories about universal biological constants." "Thank you," Tae-ho replied, surprised to find his voice steady. "I would be interested in hearing your perspective on the quantum aspects of genetic expression." A ripple of silver passed through Harry's scales. Amusement, perhaps. Most humans we meet prefer to discuss less technical matters during first meetings. "I find technical matters more comfortable," Tae-ho admitted, then immediately wished he hadn't revealed so much of himself. But Harry's scales shifted to a deep, rich purple that seemed to indicate approval. "As do I, Dr. Kim. Perhaps we could continue this discussion in your laboratory." Before Tae-ho could respond, Director Park smoothly intervened. "There will be time for scientific discussions after our welcoming ceremony. Please, follow me to the main hall." The ceremony dragged on for what felt like hours. Speeches were made, gifts were exchanged, and Tae-ho found himself stealing glances at Harry whenever he could. She stood perfectly still throughout the proceedings, but her scales never stopped moving, creating patterns that he longed to understand. Finally, the formal proceedings ended, and the scientists were free to show their visitors around the facility. To Tai-Ho's surprise and relief, Harry immediately sought him out. "Your laboratory, Dr. Kim?" she asked, her scales shimmering with anticipation. "I am particularly interested in seeing your genome mapping equipment." They walked through the facility together, drawing curious looks from both humans and Nadiri. Harry asked precise, intelligent questions about his work, showing a depth of understanding that both excited and intimidated him. In his lab, Harry moved with fluid grace between the equipment, her scales shifting through shades of blue as she examined everything with careful attention. "Your organization system is remarkably logical," she observed. "Most humans arrange their workspaces in ways we find chaotic." "I prefer order," Tai-Ho said, relaxing slightly in the familiar environment. "It helps me think more clearly." "As do we," Harry replied. She turned to face him fully, her scales settling into a steady geometric pattern. "I must admit, Dr. Kim, I specifically requested to be part of this delegation after reading your work. Your mind seems to operate in ways more similar to ours than is typical for humans." Tai-Ho felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. "I've often been told I think differently from other humans," he said quietly. "Different is not negative," Harry stated, her scales flashing with conviction. "It is through differences that new discoveries are made." She moved closer, examining the holographic display of his current project. "Tell me about this research." For the next several hours, they lost themselves in scientific discussion. Tai-Ho found himself speaking more freely than he ever had with another being. Harry understood his ideas instantly, offering insights that made his mind race with new possibilities. As the day drew to a close, Harry's scales shifted to a soft, contemplative green. "I look forward to working with you, Dr. Kim. Your species has many fascinating customs that we find difficult to understand, but your scientific mind..." Her scales rippled with appreciation. "Your scientific mind speaks a language we know well." After she left, Tai-Ho sat in his lab, replaying their conversation in his mind. For the first time in his life, he had met someone who seemed to understand him completely. The fact that she wasn't human somehow made perfect sense. That night, as he walked home under the stars, Tai-Ho felt lighter than he had in years. He had always looked to the stars for answers, but he never expected them to look back with such understanding. Tomorrow would bring more interaction with Harry and her delegation, more chances to bridge the gap between their species. As he drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with shifting colors and the musical sound of Harry's voice. Perhaps he had finally found where he belonged, not among his own kind, but in the space between worlds, where difference was not a flaw but a gift. The days slipped into a comfortable routine as Tai-Ho and Harry worked side by side in the lab. 3 weeks had passed since the Nadiri arrival, and the initial excitement had settled into a steady hum of collaborative research. For Tai-Ho, each day brought new discoveries, not just about alien biology, but about connection itself. Harry stood at the quantum microscope, her scales shifting through shades of deep blue as she studied a cellular mutation. "These patterns are fascinating," she said, not looking up. "The way human DNA responds to environmental changes is unlike anything we've seen before." Tai-Ho moved closer, careful to maintain what he had learned was a comfortable distance from Nadiri. "The adaptability of our genetic structure has always been one of our species' greatest strengths," he explained, feeling at ease in their shared enthusiasm. "Much like your personal adaptability," Harry observed, her scales flickering with what he now recognized as gentle amusement. "I've noticed how you've learned to read my color patterns. Most humans don't bother." The comment caught him off guard. "It seemed important," he said simply. "Your species communicates so much through color. It would be like ignoring half of what you're saying if I didn't try to understand." Harry's scales rippled with a warm gold that he had come to associate with approval. You see more than you realize, Taiho. She had started using his first name a week ago, after he explained human naming conventions. The way she pronounced it made it sound like music. Their work was interrupted by a knock at the lab door. Dr. Lee, head of human resources, stood there with a tight smile. Dr. Kim, might I have a word? Taiho followed him into the hallway, aware of Harry's scales shifting to a concerned violet behind him. There have been comments, Dr. Lee began, keeping his voice low, about the amount of time you're spending with the Nadiri delegate. Some feel it's becoming inappropriate. Heat crept up Taiho's neck. We're conducting vital research, he defended. The breakthroughs we're making. This isn't about the research, Dr. Lee cut in. It's about maintaining professional boundaries. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings to affect our relationship with the Nadiri. Taiho felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of misunderstandings? Dr. Lee's expression grew uncomfortable. People have noticed how you look at her. She's not human, Dr. Kim. Whatever you think might be developing between you is purely professional, Taiho finished firmly, though his heart was racing. If that's all. Back in the lab, Harry's scales had taken on a stormy gray pattern. I heard, she said quietly. Your species' hearing capabilities are quite limited compared to ours. Taiho felt his face burning. I apologize for Dr. Lee's implications. They were inappropriate. Were they? Harry asked, her scales shifting to a complex pattern he had never seen before. Your colleagues are not entirely wrong about the time we spend together, or about the way you look at me. The directness of her statement, so typical of Nadiri communication, made his breath catch. I enjoy working with you, he managed. As I enjoy working with you, she replied. But it's more than that, isn't it? I've been studying human emotional responses. Your elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, increased body temperature when we're in close proximity. These are indicators of attraction in your species. Taiho stared at her, mortified and fascinated at once. You've been monitoring my physiological responses. Harry's scales flickered with silver amusement. Just as you've been studying my color patterns. We are both scientists, after all. The tension broke, and Taiho found himself laughing. Really laughing, for the first time in months. I suppose we are. Though I'm not sure either of us expected this kind of research when we started. The most significant discoveries often come from unexpected directions, Harry said, her scales settling into a warm, deep rose color he had never seen before. I find myself experiencing responses that are unusual for my species as well. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Taiho took a deep breath. Perhaps we should study these responses. Scientifically, of course. Of course, Harry agreed, her scales rippling with what might have been pleasure. It would be negligent not to document such an unique cross-species phenomenon. They spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to work, stealing glances at each other when they thought the other wasn't looking. Every time their hands brushed while sharing equipment, Taiho felt electricity run through him, and Harry's scales would flash with brilliant colors. As the sun set outside their lab windows, Harry finally spoke again. Your species has a custom called dating, correct? A process of spending time together to evaluate compatibility. Taiho merely dropped the sample he was holding. Yes, though I'm not very good at it. Perhaps, Harry suggested, her scales shimmering with nervous energy. You've simply been dating the wrong species. The words hung between them like a bridge across the stars. Taiho looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not an alien being, but someone who understood him in ways no human ever had. Would you like to have dinner with me? He asked, amazed at his own boldness. To discuss our research, of course. Harry's scales erupted in a dazzling display of colors. I would like that very much. Though I should warn you, Nadiri eating customs are quite different from human ones. I look forward to learning them, Taiho replied, feeling as though his heart might burst from his chest. As they left the lab together that evening, neither of them noticed Dr. Lee watching from down the hall, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. Some barriers, once broken, could never be rebuilt, and perhaps they shouldn't be. For the first time in his life, Tai-ho didn't care what others thought. He had found someone who saw his differences as strengths, who understood his passion for knowledge, who made him feel like he belonged. That she came from another star system seemed, somehow, perfectly logical. The small restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of New Seoul buzzed with soft conversations as Tai-ho and Harry sat across from each other. Their first official date had drawn curious stares from other patrons, but neither seemed to notice. Harry's scales shifted through gentle shades of pink and gold as she examined the menu holoscreen with intense concentration. "These descriptions are quite poetic," she observed. "Humans seem to use many metaphors when discussing food. Dancing with flavor and explosion of taste, such violent imagery for sustenance." Tai-ho couldn't help but smile. "We tend to be emotional about our food. How do Nadiri describe their meals?" "Chemical composition, nutritional value, molecular structure," Harry replied, her scales rippling with amusement at his surprised expression. "Though I must admit, your way has a certain charm." The waiter approached their table, trying hard to maintain a professional demeanor despite his obvious fascination with Harry. "Are you ready to order?" Tai-ho had researched Nadiri dietary requirements extensively. "We'll have the vegetable tempura, minus the soy sauce, and the mushroom rice bowl, please. Both with no salt." After the waiter left, Harry's scales flickered with appreciation. "You remembered our sodium sensitivity. Most humans forget such details." "I pay attention to what matters," Tai-ho said quietly, then felt his face grow warm at the admission. Harry reached across the table, her scaled fingers brushing against his hand. The touch sent tingles up his arm. "Your attention to detail is one of the things I find most appealing about you. Among my people, such precision is highly valued." Their conversation flowed easily, moving from scientific theories to cultural differences. Harry explained how Nadiri expressed affection through color patterns and mathematical precision, while Tai-ho described the complexity of human emotional displays. "Your species uses so many subtle facial movements," Harry noted, studying his features, the slight upturn of lips, the crinkle near eyes. "It's fascinating how much information is conveyed in such tiny changes." "I've never been very good at reading those signals," Tai-ho admitted. "It's one reason I've struggled with human relationships." "But your colors." He gestured to her scales, which were currently shifting through shades of blue and violet. "They make so much more sense to me." Their food arrived, and Harry carefully examined each dish before taking a bite. Her scales flashed bright gold with pleasure at the first taste. "The molecular structure of these mushrooms is exquisite, and the way the flavors combine. Perhaps your poetic food descriptions have merit after all." As they ate, Tai-ho found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. "Sometimes I feel like I was born in the wrong time," he confessed. "Like I should have waited until humanity had evolved beyond all these complicated social rules." Harry's scales shifted to a deep, understanding purple. "Among my people, such directness would be celebrated. We find human social customs unnecessarily complex. The way you hide your true thoughts behind polite phrases, the expectation of reading unspoken signals. It seems inefficient." "Exactly," Tai-ho said, perhaps too loudly, drawing more stares from nearby tables. He lowered his voice. "Sorry, I've never had anyone understand before." "Don't apologize for enthusiasm," Harry said firmly. "Passion for understanding is beautiful. Watch." Her scales suddenly erupted in a dazzling display of shifting patterns, drawing gasps from other diners. "This is how my people express joy and discovery. No hiding, no dampening of emotion, just pure, honest reaction." Tai-ho watched in wonder as the colors danced across her scales. "It's beautiful," he breathed, "like watching the aurora borealis, but more personal." Her scales shifted to a warm rose color he was beginning to recognize as affection. You see beauty in our differences. Many would find our ways too alien, too far from human norms. I've never fit human norms anyway, Taiho said with a small shrug. Maybe that's why this feels so right. As they walked back to the research facility under the stars, Harry explained how Nadiri courtship typically progressed through carefully defined stages, each marked by specific color patterns and mathematical proofs of compatibility. It sounds much more logical than human dating, Taiho said. We just fumble around hoping to find someone who understands us. Harry stopped walking, her scales shifting to a serious deep blue. And have you found someone who understands you, Taiho? He turned to face her, gathering his courage. I think I have. Though I'm not sure how to calculate the mathematical proof of it. Her scales flickered with silver laughter. Perhaps we can create our own equations, a new formula for understanding between species. They stood there under the starlit sky, a human man and an alien woman, each seeing in the other something they had searched for all their lives. Harry's scales shifted through colors of joy, affection, and possibility, while Taiho's small smile spoke volumes to her newly trained eye. Back in his apartment that night, Taiho started a new research document, not about alien biology or cross-species genetics, but about understanding Harry's color patterns, creating his own dictionary of her emotions. Each entry was carefully documented with scientific precision, but the subject matter was purely matters of the heart. As he worked, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to fit himself into someone else's world. Instead, he and Harry were creating something entirely new, a space where their differences weren't barriers but bridges, where logic and emotion danced together like her shifting scales. News of Taiho and Harry's relationship spread through the research facility like a quantum wave, impossible to contain or predict. The whispers followed them down every corridor, a mix of fascination and disapproval that grew louder with each passing day. Taiho sat in Director Park's office, trying to keep his expression neutral as his superior paced behind the desk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the room, making the director's frown seem even deeper. Dr. Kim, you've always been one of our most valuable researchers, Director Park began, his voice carefully measured. But this situation with the Nadiri delegate has become a concern. Our work together has produced groundbreaking results, Taiho responded, pulling up holographic data on his tablet. The cross-species genetic mapping project is months ahead of schedule. This isn't about the work. Director Park sighed, settling into his chair. The Nadiri High Council has expressed concerns about personal attachments developing between our species. They're threatening to withdraw from the program. The news hit Taiho like a physical blow. Harry hasn't mentioned any concerns from her superiors. The stars twinkled outside their lab window, reminding him of the vast distances Harry had traveled to reach Earth. Now, facing the possibility of losing her, those same stars seemed like a threat, ready to take her back to her world, leaving him alone again in a society that had never truly accepted him. But as he watched her scales shimmer with determination while she worked, Taiho knew they would find a way. Their love might not fit any traditional pattern, human or Nadiri, but perhaps that was exactly why it mattered so much. They were writing a new chapter in the story of both their species, and he refused to let anyone end it prematurely. The alarm blared through the research facility with deafening intensity, its red warning lights casting eerie shadows across the corridors. Taiho's heart pounded as he ran toward the containment labs, where the emergency signal had originated. Harry's scales had flashed sharp warning colors just moments before the alarm sounded, her advanced Nadiri senses detecting the danger before the human systems could. Containment breach in Lab 7. The AI's voice echoed through the building. Unknown pathogen detected. All personnel evacuate immediately. But Taiho couldn't evacuate. Lab 7 was where the joint human-Nadiri research team had been studying alien microorganisms. More importantly, it was where Harry had been working when the alarm sounded. He reached the quarantine doors just as they were sealing shut. Through the reinforced glass, he could see several researchers trapped inside, including 3 Nadiri scientists. Harry stood at her workstation, her scales flashing urgent patterns of distress as she tried to contain the spreading contamination. The pathogen is affecting both human and Nadiri physiology. Her voice came through the intercom, strained but controlled. Standard containment protocols are failing. Director Park arrived with the emergency response team, his face grim. We need to initiate full lockdown. The risk of cross-species contamination is too high. Wait. Tahoe stepped forward, his mind racing. The pathogen is affecting both species differently. Let me access the data. Harry and I have been studying the interaction between human and Nadiri cellular structures. Inside the lab, one of the human researchers collapsed, while the Nadiri scientist's scales had turned a sickly gray. Harry moved between them, her own scales showing signs of distress, but still maintaining their vibrant patterns. The pathogen targets specific genetic markers, Harry reported through the intercom. It's adapting to both our species simultaneously. Taiho rushed to the external computer terminal, his fingers flying over the holographic controls. Harry, remember our research on cross-species immune responses, the way human and Nadiri antibodies interact. Her scales flickered with understanding. The complementary protein structures, but we'd need both species immune responses working in perfect synchronization if we can synthesize a combined treatment. Taiho began. It would work on both species at once. Harry finished his thought, her scales flashing with academic excitement despite the danger. Director Park looked between them, confusion clear on his face. What are you talking about? Our research, Tahoe explained quickly. We discovered that human and Nadiri immune systems, while very different, can work together in ways we never imagined. We've been studying it in secret, afraid our findings would be used to further separate our species. Inside the lab, another researcher fell unconscious. Harry's scales showed increasing signs of infection, but she continued working. The synthesis chamber is still operational, she reported, but someone needs to manually combine the compounds. You can't, Taiho protested, seeing her intention. You're already infected, which makes me the perfect test subject. Her scales shifted to a pattern he'd never seen before, a complex swirl of love, determination, and scientific curiosity. The next hour passed in a blur of intense collaboration. While the emergency teams watched helplessly, Taiho and Harry worked together across the quarantine barrier, combining their knowledge of both species biology to create something entirely new. The bacterial proteins are binding, Harry reported, her voice weakening, but her scales still showing sharp patterns of concentration. The human antibodies are responding exactly as you predicted. Taiho hadn't slept in 24 hours, running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. The Nadiri immune response should activate when the temperature reaches optimal levels. Finally, the synthesis chamber hummed with completion. Harry lifted the first dose with trembling hands, her scales now showing clear signs of the infection's progression. It has to work, Taiho whispered, pressing his hand against the glass barrier that separated them. Harry administered the treatment to herself first, then to the other infected researchers. For several tense minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Then slowly her scales began to regain their healthy luster. The human researchers' vital signs stabilized, and the Nadiri scientists' scales returned to their normal patterns. The quarantine wasn't lifted for another 12 hours, but when it finally was, Harry stepped out into Tahoe's waiting arms, her scales blazing with triumphant colors that made the human emergency team shield their eyes. You did it, Director Park said, shaking his head in amazement. We did it, Tahoe corrected, still holding Harry close. Together, because we understand each other in ways neither of our species thought possible. The news of their breakthrough spread faster than the pathogen had. Within hours, both the human scientific community and the Nadiri High Council were demanding details of their research. The same relationship that had been condemned days before was now being hailed as the key to unprecedented medical advances. That evening, as they sat together in their lab, Harry's scales shifted through gentle patterns of contentment. "They cannot separate us now," she said softly. "We've proven that our connection produces results neither species could achieve alone." Tahoe smiled, understanding the complex color patterns that rippled across her scales: love, pride, and a touch of mischievous satisfaction. "We did more than save lives today," he said. "We showed them that differences can be strengths. And that sometimes," Harry added, her scales shimmering with joy, "the most important discoveries come from following your heart, even when everyone tells you it's impossible." They stayed in the lab late into the night, documenting their breakthrough and planning future research. The stars twinkled outside their window, no longer seeming like a barrier between their worlds, but rather a bridge they had built together. A year after the containment incident, Tahoe stood before a packed auditorium of humans in Nadiri, his heart racing with familiar nervousness. But this time, Harry stood beside him, her scales shimmering with encouraging patterns of gold and blue. The crowd before them represented both their worlds: scientists, diplomats, and even members of the Nadiri High Council who had once opposed their relationship. "The success of the cross-species medical initiative has exceeded all expectations," Tahoe began, his voice steady despite his anxiety. "What started as an unlikely partnership has grown into something revolutionary." Harry's scales rippled with pride as she took over the presentation. "Our initial breakthrough during the containment crisis was just the beginning. The combination of human adaptability and Nadiri precision has opened doors we never imagined possible." The holographic display behind them showed their latest results. Diseases that had plagued both species for centuries were now treatable through their combined approach. But more than that, their work had sparked a cultural revolution. After their presentation, Director Park approached them with a broad smile, something that had become increasingly common over the past year. "The funding for the new Cross-Species Research Center has been approved. You'll have everything you need to expand your work." Harry's scales flickered with excitement, a pattern Tahoe had grown to love. "And the Council's decision?" she asked. "They've agreed to establish a permanent scientific exchange program," Director Park confirmed. "Your success has convinced them that closer cooperation between our species is not just possible, but essential." Later that evening, Tahoe and Harry walked through the garden where they had once hidden their relationship. Now they weren't alone. Other human Naduri couples had followed their example, finding connection across the stars. "Remember when we used to worry about our differences?" Tahoe asked, watching a young human researcher earnestly studying the color patterns of her Nadiri companion. Harry's scales shifted to a warm, reminiscent purple. "Those differences saved lives. They changed worlds." She paused, her scales showing a pattern of nervous anticipation that Tahoe had never seen before. "And speaking of changes," she held out a small device that projected a complex mathematical equation into the air between them. Tahoe recognized it as a traditional Nadiri marriage proposal, but with a unique twist. Mixed into the elegant mathematical proofs were elements of human romance, creating something entirely new. "This is our equation," Harai explained, her scales shifting through rainbow patterns of emotion. "Not purely Nadiri, not purely human, but perfectly us. Will you help me solve it for the rest of our lives?" Tahoe felt tears in his eyes as he reached for her hand. "I thought I'd be alone forever," he whispered. "Then I found you across the stars." Their wedding, held 6 months later, blended traditions from both worlds. Tahoe wore traditional Korean formal wear, while Harry's scales displayed the sacred patterns of Madiri bonding ceremonies. His mother, who had once feared their relationship, now beamed with pride as she helped adjust Harry's ceremonial adornments. The research facility had been transformed for the occasion, its sterile halls filled with flowers and floating lights. Humans and Nadiri mingled freely, their initial awkwardness forgotten in the joy of celebration. As they spoke their vows, his in words, hers in shifting colors that painted the air with emotion, Tahoe realized how far they had come. The man who had once felt rejected by his own species had found not just acceptance, but a whole new way of seeing the universe. Their honeymoon was spent establishing the first cross-species relationship center, a place where others like them could find guidance and support. Harry's scales would glow with satisfaction every time another couple found their way to understanding across the cultural divide. "We're writing a new chapter in the story of both our species," she told him one evening as they watched the sunset from their new home. "A unique dwelling designed to accommodate both their needs. But more importantly, we're writing our own story." Tahoe smiled, having learned to read the complex emotions in her shifting scales as easily as any Nadiri. A story about finding love across the stars, he said, about how being different isn't a flaw, but a gift. Hari's scales shimmered with joy and mischief, and about a human scientist who finally found someone who appreciated his tendency to talk about quantum physics during dinner. They laughed together, their happiness a testament to the power of love to bridge any distance, even the vast expanse of space between stars. Their differences, once seen as barriers, had become the very foundation of their bond. The universe, they had discovered, had a way of bringing together those who needed each other most. Sometimes the greatest love stories weren't written in the stars, but in the spaces between them, where two hearts from different worlds could find each other and create something entirely new. As night fell and the stars emerged, Tahoe and Harry stood together on their balcony, their silhouettes merging into one. Her scales painted patterns of love and contentment in the darkness, while his smile spoke of a man who had finally found his place in the universe. They had proved that love knew no boundaries, not of species, not of culture, not even of stars. In finding each other, they had opened a door for others to follow, showing that the greatest discoveries often came not from looking up at the stars, but into the hearts of those who were different from ourselves. And so their story continued, not an ending, but a beginning, as they explored new horizons together, their love lighting the way for others to follow across the vast expanse of space and time.